We know that the SOI, or the Southern Oscillation Index, that's the moving average of it, the 20-year moving average, has made some substantial shift that occurred. We don't know why it occurred, but it's now down here in a new domain, and it hasn't shifted back. So we know that that's one of those thresholds, or abrupt or irreversible changes that have occurred. The interesting thing for here to note in terms of the pastoral sector is during those El Nino events, when that warm water is out in the eastern equatorial zone, the cyclones form at the same rate, pack up their bags and go out to sea. When the warm water is on the eastern seaboard of Australia, the La Nina event, they form at the same rate and they track onto the eastern seaboard. Now, cyclones around the globe have not increased in number. What has changed is the numbers of 1s and 2s have declined substantially, and the numbers of 4s and 5s have increased enormously. So the numbers haven't increased. And in Australia, the rainfall pattern hasn't changed that much either. We still receive about the same amount of rainfall. It just falls in very different places. I'm cheating a little bit. Rainfall, well, climate's a very complex phenomena, but we're interested in the Madden-Julian oscillation, or the 40-day wave, and the SOI, which is the thing we're focusing on here today. I just want to look at, very briefly, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology data. This is a 100-year data set, of 1900 to 2008. This is 10 years, so the trend in annual rainfall in millimetres per decade, so the change. And you can see some wetting in the northwest and Western Australia, some drying on the eastern seaboard. But because, and this is millimetres, so millimetres per decade, because we're talking about 100 years, there's a lot of loss of the evidence that is tied up in this data set. If you have a look at a 50-year period, so 1950s to 2008, you can see that the change is quite marked. And in fact, most of the eastern seaboard has lost between 25 to 35% of its long-term average rainfall. So in some cases, it's 250 to 350 millimetres of rain has gone from that 1,000 mil isol height that sits down the eastern seaboard. Note the wetting over here, so this area is getting proportionally wetter, and that's the tracking of the cyclones coming onto the Western Australian seaboard, and their spinifex communities are starting to curl up their toes because they're getting too wet. Note that as we sit here, there's not a lot of change. Let's have a look at another graph where it's a little more evident. So that's the 1970. This is the 10-year moving average. You can see that the rate of change is accelerating, is the point you need to take away here. We sit in this area around here, which hasn't seen a great deal of change in terms of the average annual rainfall. What you have experienced, and will markedly affect your business and water supply and grazing productivity, is the variability, so the type and style and seasonality of the rainfall. Where's the water all falling or runoff in Australia? As a sort of throwaway line, 4% of the Australia's water discharges down through the Murray-Darling, but it represents about 80% of our irrigation infrastructure. So where is likely developmental pressure going to occur in the future? Likely to be up in the northern portion of Australia, where there hasn't been a lot of change in rainfall. The southern portion of Australia, by the way, is driven by a thing called a circumpolar vortex, so it's quite a different rainfall regime. This is just Rockhampton as a major city that has a long record for you. You can see the trend line there at the turn of the century, around 1,000 mils on average. It's around about 680 Rocky now on average. That's the long-term 20-year moving average, 20-year moving average, not last year's average, 20-year moving average. So that's the average for the last 20 years. Here we can see the stream discharge, which is an interesting phenomenon. So 25% discharge or reduction in rainfall in Rocky has yielded a 50% decline in stream discharge. Now, I've chosen the Calliope River because it's an unimpounded storage on the eastern drainage system. Let's have a look at another one. That's Brisbane River. Now, the point that I would draw your attention to is this data set is very short. And so you wouldn't put your short and curlies on that trend line, but it's a useful indicator as to where it's headed. And that's why Brisbane is starting to suffer from so many water shortages as well. But again, the same trend, 25% reduction in rainfall, 50% reduction in stream discharge. Think a little bit about that in terms of your own situation and dam infill and groundwater reserves as well. There's Western Australia to show that it's fairly consistent regardless of where you go, and they're talking about a 68% reduction in stream discharge and are seriously concerned and looking for desal plants ad nauseum. The temperature is an interesting phenomenon in the sense that we're finding that the maximum temperatures are rising quite substantially, but again you're talking about small numbers, but that does not mean low impact. They are very big impacts in terms of the extremes. The numbers of days above 40, 36 degrees are quite substantial. The interesting thing is that the minimum temperatures are rising at a far greater rate than the maximum. So you're finding that a lot of the cooler days are disappearing. You're getting warmer, more consistent temperatures with a continual increase of the upper level as well. If you have a look at just some of the temperatures there that are projected for the future by CSIRO, 2007, Brisbane currently experiences about 3 days above 35 degrees, with a projection that they'll experience 35 days out to 2070. I would expect that this figure of 6 is on an average is already probably double that already. And that's another interesting point which I'll show you, is that most of the projections have been so conservative that the rate of change has almost doubled the predicted. The rate of change has doubled the predicted. There's the temperatures below. Obviously has serious implications for frosting and cooling, particularly in the crops that require that sort of thing, but you can see quite marked changes for yourself, a couple there, Charleville and Tambo, and you can see quite marked reductions in the number of cold days. The big issue with the temperature rise is the rate at which it will increase evapotranspiration, so the rate of loss. So if you're in a 600 mil ISO height and you're losing 100 mils, you've lost a substantial amount of your rain without any reduction in rainfall at all. So the stresses that it places on the plant, the growing length and the available soil moisture is substantially reduced. Just to give you an idea, the Department of Environment and Water in Canberra thought they'd do a little bit of a plot as to what would happen if you cranked up the temperature 1 or 2 degrees, 3 degrees, 5 degrees. And you can see some highlighted areas of some major icons that sit around Australia in the sense of where losses will occur. I spent a fair bit of time looking at the reef, and there are some very interesting shifts in the dynamics of the biology of the reef. Talking of the reef, coral bleaching is increasing. Now, coral bleaching in itself isn't a problem. It's the duration of the coral bleaching and the frequency of the coral bleaching. So if the stress stays on the little zooxanthellae, as they're referred to, for extended periods of time, they all bail out of the coral and the coral bleaches. If the temperature cools, they all get back in, if you like. But if you continue to stress them, they all curl up their toes and die, and so the reef changes in its structure and form. But here is a graph just showing you the rate of which coral bleaching incidence has increased enormously. Now you can dig up any coral any time and core down through it and get a very accurate record of what's occurred in terms of stresses on that coral. Most of you think that you can't kill a eucalypt with Roundup. Well, you can. You just crank up the temperature a little bit and you'll do a fair bit of damage. Now that 53% of eucalypts have a climate range of less than 3 degrees is largely to do with a lot of the more tropical species, if you like, as opposed to the arid ones. But even there's 25% of them with a span of less than 1 degrees. So even some of the trees will change in terms of the type and distribution of those species. Interesting thing to look at the insurance claims and the number of extreme events. A lot of this, you can see the exponential rate of increase through time, probably driven by population growth and insurance covers and that sort of stuff. The independent thing here is the number of events that is recorded across the axes at the bottom. So this is the Australian Insurance Group, and you can see that they recorded 13 events between 50 and 60, 16 between 60 and 70, 29 between 70 and 80, 44 to 90, and 72 from 1990 to 1998. So the number of extreme events is increasing quite markedly.